For 58 years, my daughter Donna lived believing her father was a kind, hard-working man named Charles, a young hero taken from us far too soon by a tragic factory accident. I had told her about a man who had loved her before she was even born, a man whose memory we should cherish with a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was a lie, of course, a necessary one, I told myself, a shield I crafted to protect her from a truth so jagged and cruel I was certain it would tear her apart. But the truth has a way of sleeping, not dying. It lies dormant for decades, and you can almost convince yourself it's gone forever, until one day it begins to stir. And when Donna, in her own search for justice, began investigating the very man who was her true father, when she started collecting the testimonies of women he had broken, I understood my shield was about to shatter. Fate had chosen her to unearth a monster, never knowing that the monster's blood ran in her own veins. My name is Mildred, and I am 82 years old. I live in a small third-floor walk-up in a quiet neighborhood of Chicago, where the seasons change with a gentle predictability that has been the balm of my life. The rumble of the L train a few blocks away is a constant, comforting lullaby, so different from the suffocating silence of the place where my story truly began. Today, I won't speak of the life I built here, brick by painful brick. Today, I will take you back to the story that has been locked in the deepest part of my heart for more than 60 years. A secret that has burned quietly, relentlessly, day and night. It's a story that begins in the suffocating heat of a Mississippi summer, in a place lost in time, where girls like me were taught that our voices were whispers and our bodies were not our own. Please subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on this video. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? I was born in 1943, into a family of sharecroppers whose only real inheritance was honesty and exhaustion. My father, Earl, was a man whose hands were permanently stained by the soil and whose back was bent into a constant curve from a lifetime of labor. He worked the vast cotton fields belonging to Mr. Harrington, one of the most powerful and feared men in the county. Mr. Harrington owned thousands of acres of land, a cotton gin that decided the fate of every family for miles around, and a grand white house that sat atop a hill, looking down on our small, weathered shacks like a king from his castle. My mother, Lois, worked just as hard. She tended to our small vegetable patch, raised chickens, and took in washing from the overseer's wife to earn a few extra cents. Her hands were always chapped and red, and by nightfall, a weariness settled so deep in her bones that she would sometimes nod off at the dinner table before her food was half eaten. I was their only surviving child. 2 boys had come before me, but the fevers and hardships of that life had claimed them both before their first birthdays. Perhaps that's why my mother watched over me with the fierce, anxious energy of a hen with her last chick. But protection has its limits in a world built on poverty and power. My schooling ended the year I turned 16. There was no discussion. Another pair of hands was needed to ensure we didn't fall deeper into debt with Mr. Harrington at the company store. For 2 years, I worked in the fields, my fingers learning the sting of the cotton boll. Shortly after I turned 18, because I was known as a responsible, quiet girl, I was finally promoted to work as a maid in the big house. It was considered a great honor. Working in the main house meant better pay, scraps from a better kitchen, and the chance to wear a clean uniform instead of sun-beaten field clothes. My mother was bursting with a quiet pride on my first day, having starched my simple uniform until it was stiff and braiding my hair so tightly it pulled at my temples. "You listen to Mrs. Harrington, you hear?" she'd said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "You do what you're told, keep your eyes down, and you say yes, ma'am, and no, sir. Don't you give them any reason to find fault." The house was like another world. The rooms were vast and cool, smelling of lemon polish and old wood. My job was to keep the downstairs pristine, dusting the endless array of porcelain figures, polishing silver that was used only for important guests, and tending to the grand library, a room filled with hundreds of leather-bound books that I was certain no one ever read. They were for show, like everything else in that house. Mr. Harrington was a man in his late 60s then, with a stern, imposing presence and eyes that looked right through you. His wife was a frail woman who spent most of her days in her room with what was called a delicate constitution. They had one son, Gary. In the summer of 1961, Gary was 20 years old, just 2 years older than me. He was studying business up north at a fancy university and was home for the summer. He carried himself with the easy arrogance of someone who had never been told no, who saw the world and everyone in it as existing for his pleasure. The other girls in the county would whisper and giggle when he drove past in his father's gleaming Buick, the radio playing loud. But his presence filled me with a vague, prickling unease I couldn't name. From the very first day he returned that summer, I felt his eyes on me. It wasn't the dismissive glance of a master to a servant. It was different. It was a heavy, assessing gaze that lingered too long and made my skin crawl. When I served iced tea on the veranda, I could feel him watching my every move. If I was dusting in the hall, he would find a reason to walk past, his shoulder brushing mine in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental. He'd ask me questions, his voice smooth and low. "Mildred, how's your father's crop coming along?" Or, "It's a hot one today, isn't it?" The words were harmless, but the look in his eyes made them feel like threats. I started to feel a knot of dread tighten in my stomach every morning. I tried to make myself invisible, to move through the house like a ghost. I'd listen for his footsteps, changing my path to avoid whichever room he was in. But in a house where my duties were to be seen and not heard, our paths were destined to cross. I'm sure many of you ladies listening today know exactly what I'm talking about. That feeling when a man with power looks at you a certain way, and you just know, that your word means nothing against his. It's a silent, terrifying language that women have been forced to learn for generations. I couldn't say anything, of course. Who would I tell? My mother? She would have been terrified and she would have blamed me. "What did you do?" she would ask. "Did you look at him? Did you smile?" My father? He would have been fired from the only work he had ever known, and our family would have been cast out with nothing, blacklisted from every farm in the county. The silent rule was simple. The Harringtons were law, and we were less than dust beneath their feet. So I held my fear inside, praying for the summer to end, for him to return to his university up north and leave me in peace. The night it happened was in late July. The air was thick and heavy, so humid it felt like you were breathing water. A chorus of cicadas buzzed from the oak trees, a sound so loud and constant it felt like the whole world was screaming. I was in the library, my last task of the day. It was usually my favorite chore. The room was quiet and smelled of paper and leather, and I could run my fingers along the spines of the books and imagine the worlds hidden inside them. I was on a small stepladder, carefully dusting the highest shelf, when I heard heavy footsteps on the polished hardwood floor of the hall. I recognized Gary's confident, unhurried tread immediately, so different from his father's slower, more deliberate pace. My heart began to pound against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I kept my back to the door, praying he would walk past, that he was on his way to his room. He didn't. The library door swung open, and I felt a shift in the air as he entered the room. I didn't turn around. I just kept wiping the shelf with my dust cloth, my movements becoming stiff and jerky. I pretended to be completely absorbed in my work, hoping my invisibility cloak was still working. Then I heard a sound that made the blood in my veins turn to ice, the soft, definitive click of a key turning in the lock. I spun around on the stepladder so fast I nearly lost my balance. He was there, leaning against the now locked door, watching me with a small, knowing smile that held no warmth at all. "Good evening, Mildred," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "Working hard, I see." Mr. Gary, I managed to say, my own voice a reedy whisper. My hands were trembling, and I clutched the dust rag as if it were a lifeline. I was just finishing up. I'll be out of your way in a moment. There's no rush, he said, pushing himself off the door and starting to walk slowly toward me. In fact, I wanted to have a little chat with you. Each step he took echoed in the silent room, a drumbeat counting down my final moments of safety. I backed away instinctively, stepping down from the ladder until my back was pressed hard against the unyielding wall of books. There was nowhere else to go. The smell of his cologne, something expensive and musky, reached me, mingling with the faint scent of whiskey on his breath. It was a sickening combination that made my stomach churn. What did you want to talk about, sir?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He was closer now, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Oh, I think you know," he said, that awful smile widening. "You're not as innocent as you pretend to be. A girl like you, with your assets. You know what goes on between a man and a woman." "I don't know what you mean, sir," I lied, though I knew exactly where this was going. In my world, girls learned the ugly truths of life early, even if they were never spoken aloud. "Sure you do," he purred, his eyes dropping from my face to my body in a way that made me feel naked and exposed. He reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair from my cheek, his touch making me flinch as if I'd been burned. "I've seen the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. Don't play shy now." It was a monstrous lie. I had never looked at him with anything but fear. I had done everything in my power to avoid him. But I was beginning to understand that my reality didn't matter. He had already written the script for this encounter, and my role was assigned. My will was irrelevant. I tried to sidestep him, to dart past him toward the locked door, but he was too quick. His hand shot out and clamped around my wrist. His grip was like a steel trap, the force of it so sudden and shocking it sent a jolt of pain up my arm. His fingers dug into my flesh, and I could feel the terrifying strength he possessed. "Please," I begged, the word catching in my throat. "Please let me go." "Shh," he whispered, bringing his other hand up to my face, his thumb stroking my jaw. "Don't fight it. You know you want this." The events that followed are a memory I have tried to bury for 60 years, a nightmare that refuses to fade with time. It surfaces in the dead of night, as vivid and terrifying as the moment it happened. His heavy hand covered my mouth when I tried to scream, the smell of whiskey and cologne filling my nostrils, choking me. I felt the rough wool of his jacket against my cheek and the cold, hard spines of the books pressing into my back. The pain in my body was a distant, secondary thing compared to the shattering of my soul, the brutal theft of my innocence under the silent, leather-bound gazes of 1,000 unread books. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to transport myself somewhere else, anywhere else. I thought of the cotton fields under a blue sky, of my mother's humming as she kneaded dough, of anything pure and good that this man could not touch, could not taint. When it was over, he stood up and straightened his clothes with an unnerving casualness, as if he had just finished a pleasant conversation. I remained slumped against the bookshelf, too broken to move, too numb to think. A profound, hollow silence filled the room, broken only by my ragged, silent gasps for air. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable for a moment, before it hardened into a sneer. "If you breathe a word of this to anyone," he said, his voice a low, vicious hiss as he tucked in his shirt, "my father will throw your family off this land so fast you won't have time to pack. You'll starve, and don't think for a second anyone will believe you. Who do you think they'll listen to? The ignorant daughter of a sharecropper, or me?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I'll tell them you begged for it. I'll tell them you came in here and threw yourself at me. I will ruin you, Mildred. I will destroy what little reputation you have, and you and your family will have nothing. Do you understand me?" His words were not just threats. They were a statement of fact. He was right. In that world, in that time, I had no voice. I had no power. A girl's reputation was her only currency, and he had the power not only to steal my body, but to rewrite my story into something ugly and false, and everyone would believe him. He had taken everything, and now he was salting the earth so that nothing could ever grow there again. He unlocked the door without another glance in my direction and walked out, leaving me alone in the wreckage. I don't know how long I remained on the cold floor of that library, a crumpled heap of torn fabric and shattered dignity. It could have been minutes, or it could have been an hour. Time had lost all meaning, stretching and contracting in horrifying ways. The world had been reduced to the scent of his cologne lingering in the air, the sticky dampness on my cheeks where his hand had been, and the deep, throbbing ache that was spreading through my body. But the physical pain was nothing, a distant echo compared to the screaming void that had opened up inside me. A part of me had died in that room, the young, hopeful part, and I knew with a chilling certainty that it would never come back. Eventually, the survival instinct that is buried deep within all of us began to stir. I had to move. I couldn't be found here. With movements that felt slow and clumsy, as if I were a stranger in my own body, I pushed myself up. My reflection in the dark glass of a bookcase was a distorted, monstrous version of the girl who had entered this room an hour before. My uniform was torn at the shoulder, my hair had come undone from its tight braid, and my eyes were wide with a terror that felt ancient. I tidied myself as best I could, my hands shaking so violently I could barely button my collar. I left the library without looking back, each step an agony, and slipped out of the house through the kitchen door, melting into the thick, inky blackness of the Mississippi night. The walk home was usually about a mile along a packed dirt road. That night, it felt like a journey across a hostile alien planet. Every rustle in the tall grass alongside the road was a threat. Every hoot of an owl in the distant trees sounded like a mournful cry for what I had lost. The moon was high and full, casting long, skeletal shadows from the cypress trees that seemed to reach for me like grasping fingers. I walked with my arms wrapped tightly around myself, trying to hold together the pieces of who I was, but I felt like a shattered vase, hopelessly broken. Gary's words echoed in my head, a cruel and relentless mantra of my own powerlessness. "Who do you think they'll listen to? I will ruin you. I will destroy you." He had not just violated my body, he had poisoned the very air I breathed, turning my entire world into a cage. When the dim, yellow light of our shack finally appeared through the trees, I felt no relief, only a fresh wave of dread. How could I face them? How could I walk into that small home, which had always been my sanctuary, and pretend that I was the same daughter who had left that morning? My mother, Lois, was waiting on the porch steps, a familiar silhouette in the darkness. She always waited up for me. "Mildred? That you?" she called out, her voice tight with worry. "It's late. Everything all right?" As I stepped into the faint light spilling from the doorway, she must have seen something in my face. She stood up, her expression shifting from impatience to alarm. "Good Lord, child, you're white as a sheet. What happened? Did you get sick?" "I'm fine, Mama," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. My voice was a croak, raw and broken. "Just tired." It was a long day. She reached out to touch my arm, but I flinched away, a reaction so sharp and involuntary it startled us both. Her hand froze in the air between us. Her eyes, so full of a farmer's practical wisdom, narrowed as she studied me. She saw the torn shoulder of my uniform, the wildness in my eyes. I saw 1,000 questions form on her lips, but I also saw her deliberately swallow them. In our world, there were questions you did not ask because you could not bear to hear the answers. To know would be to be implicated, and to be implicated was to be in danger. Her silence was not a lack of love, it was a form of self-preservation, a lesson learned over a lifetime of servitude. "Well," she said finally, her voice strained, "get on inside and get some rest. There's leftover cornbread on the stove if you're hungry." She didn't press. She let me carry my terrible secret inside with me, and I was both grateful for and devastated by her restraint. That night, I did not sleep. I lay on my thin mattress, staring into the darkness, and relived every horrifying second. His smile, his voice, the crushing weight of him. I got up twice to be sick in the slop pail, my body convulsing with dry, heaving sobs. But there was nothing in my stomach to bring up. The sickness was in my soul. The weeks that followed were a special kind of hell, a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. I had to continue working at the big house. We needed the money too desperately for me to stop. Every morning was a battle, forcing my trembling legs to carry me up the long drive to that house of horrors. The house itself seemed to mock me. The polished floors, the gleaming silver, the silent, orderly rooms, they all felt like a lie, a beautiful facade hiding a rotten core. I worked with a frantic, desperate energy, scrubbing and polishing as if I could somehow wash away the filth I felt inside me. And I had to see him. Gary seemed to take a perverse pleasure in my terror. He never tried to touch me again, but he would find ways to remind me of his power. He would appear silently in a doorway as I worked, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. He would cross my path in the hallway and pause, his eyes raking over me in a way that made me feel like I was back in that library, pinned against the wall. He was reminding me that I was his, that he owned my fear. Each encounter left me shaking and nauseous, my carefully constructed composure crumbling to dust. I lived in a constant state of high alert, my nerves stretched so taut I felt they might snap. Then, about a month after that night, a new and different kind of dread began to creep in. It started with a weariness in the mornings that went beyond my usual exhaustion. It was a bone-deep fatigue, accompanied by waves of nausea that would send me rushing out to the back garden, my head hanging over the tomato plants. At first, I told myself it was just the stress, the constant gnawing fear eating away at me. I prayed that's all it was. But when the end of the month came and went, and my monthly cycle did not arrive, a cold, paralyzing terror took hold of me. I waited another week, and then another, my days filled with a frantic, desperate bargaining with God. Please, no, not this. Anything but this. But my body, which already felt like a site of betrayal, had betrayed me once more. The signs were undeniable. I knew, with the kind of certainty that sinks like a stone to the bottom of your heart, that I was carrying Gary Harrington's child. The world didn't just collapse, it ceased to exist. All that was left was this horrifying biological fact. I was carrying the seed of my own violation, a living, growing reminder of my powerlessness. For days, I walked around in a fog, unable to process the sheer magnitude of my catastrophe. This secret was no longer just mine. It had a life of its own, a life that would soon become visible to the entire world. Finally, I knew I could not hold it in any longer. I had to tell my mother. I found her out by the chicken coop one afternoon, scattering feed for the hens. The late September sun was casting long shadows, and the air was beginning to carry the first faint hint of an autumn chill. "Mama," I began, my voice so thin it was barely a whisper. She looked up, her face already etched with the worry she'd been carrying for weeks. "What is it, Mildred?" The words wouldn't come. They were lodged in my throat, a thick, thorny knot of shame and terror. I just stood there, tears beginning to stream down my face, my hands instinctively going to my still flat stomach. Her eyes followed my gesture. I saw comprehension dawn on her face, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated horror. Her face went slack, all the color draining from it. The tin of chicken feed slipped from her fingers, scattering across the dusty ground. "No," she breathed, the word a prayer and a curse. "Oh Lord in heaven, no!" She stumbled backward and sank onto a nearby tree stump as if her legs had given out. "Who?" she whispered, her eyes wide and pleading. "Tell me it's not." "It's him," I sobbed, the words finally tearing free. "It's Gary. Mama, he forced me. That night in the library, he hurt me." I waited for her to come to me, to wrap her arms around me and tell me it would be all right, that we would face this together. I needed my mother, her comfort, her strength. But the woman who looked back at me was not my mother. She was a terrified stranger, her mind already racing with the catastrophic implications. "You can't tell anyone," she said, her voice sharp, frantic. "Do you hear me, Mildred? Not a soul. This will ruin us. This will destroy your father." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "We will make him pay." But "This will ruin us." I looked at the woman who had brought me into the world, the woman I loved more than anyone, and I saw only fear. I realized then that I was truly alone. My violation was not the tragedy. The consequences of my violation, the shame, the scandal, the ruin it would bring upon our family, that was the tragedy. "But Mama, he raped me," I cried, my voice rising with disbelief. "He's a monster. It's not right." "Right?" she scoffed, a bitter, hysterical sound. She stood up and began pacing, her hands twisting in her apron. "What does right have to do with anything? We are who we are, and they are who they are. Do you think for one second that Mr. Harrington will let his son be accused by the likes of us? They will crush us, Mildred. Earl will lose his place. We will be thrown off this land with nothing but the clothes on our backs. We will starve. And you? You will be branded for life. No decent man will ever look at you again. Is that the justice you want?" Every word she spoke was another bar in the cage that was closing around me. I know it's hard to understand now, but their fear was a real and powerful thing. In their world, honor and survival were intertwined, and they saw my tragedy only through the lens of their own ruin. Perhaps some of you who grew up in similar times can understand that kind of impossible choice. They were not evil. They were trapped, just as I was. That evening, when my father came home from the fields, my mother told him. I huddled in my small room, pressing my ear against the thin wooden wall, dreading what was to come. I heard my mother's low, trembling voice, and then my father's roar of disbelief. "What?" The sound of a chair scraping violently across the floor made me jump. "Pregnant? What do you mean she's pregnant?" "It was the Harrington boy, Earl," my mother explained, her voice pleading. "He forced himself on her." "Forced himself?" my father yelled, and I could hear the venom in his voice was directed not at Gary, but at me. "She must have been asking for it, parading around that house making eyes at him. I told you, Lois. I told you sending her to work in that house was a mistake. And now look. Look at the shame she has brought on us. We're finished." I heard my mother trying to calm him, her voice a low murmur against his storm of rage. "It's a disgrace," he bellowed. "How are we supposed to hold our heads up in church? How are we supposed to face anyone?" Not once did he say my name with compassion. Not once did he curse the boy who had done this. His concern was for his pride, his reputation, his survival. In that moment, something inside me hardened. The soft heart of a girl was replaced by something cold and resilient. I had no one. I would have to save myself. The days that followed were suffocating. My father wouldn't speak to me. He wouldn't even look at me. When he passed me in our tiny shack, he would turn his head away as if the sight of me was a physical affliction. My mother moved about her chores with a grim, tight-lipped desperation. The love in our home had been replaced by fear and shame. One evening, about a week later, my parents sat me down at the small kitchen table. My father still wouldn't look at me, addressing his words to a spot on the wall just over my head. "We've written to your Aunt Clara," he said, his voice flat and cold, "in Chicago." Aunt Clara was my mother's older sister, a woman I hadn't seen since I was a small child. She had left Mississippi years ago and was now a widow, living alone in the city. "You'll go there," he continued. "No one knows you there. You'll have the baby, and we'll figure out what to do after." "You'll tell people you're a widow," my mother added, her voice low and hurried, as if she were coaching me in a play. "We'll invent a husband for you. A good boy from back home, Charles. We'll say he died in a terrible accident at the lumber mill a few months after you were married. It's a believable story. It will protect you. It will protect the child." "And the baby?" I asked, my voice numb. "The baby will be raised as Charles's child. It will never know the truth. It will never know about this place," my father finished, waving a hand in disgust. I understood it was not a negotiation. It was a sentence. I was being exiled, my identity erased and rewritten to hide their shame. But as I sat there, a spark of something defiant ignited within me. Perhaps this exile was also an escape, away from this place, away from my father's judgment and my mother's fear, away from Gary Harrington's predatory gaze. Maybe, just maybe, in a place as big as Chicago, I could build a new life. I could forget. "When do I leave?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "Next week," my father said, finally looking at me, his eyes full of a cold, hard finality. "Your aunt is expecting you." That last week was a blur. My mother packed a small, battered cardboard suitcase for me with my few dresses and a worn-out Bible. She pressed $50 into my hand, a fortune, all the money she had saved in secret over the years. "You write to us, you hear?" she whispered, her embrace quick and furtive, her tears hot on my cheek. It was the only affection she had shown me since I'd told her. My father was not there to say goodbye. He made sure to be out in the farthest fields and did not return until long after the neighbor had driven me to the train station. His absence was his final, damning statement. On the morning of October 15th, 1961, I stepped onto a train heading north. I was 18 years old, pregnant with my rapist's child, and holding a one-way ticket into exile. As the train lurched forward and began to pull away from the station, I looked out the window at the flat, dusty landscape of my home, at the cotton fields stretching to the horizon. I was losing everything I had ever known. But as the familiar scenery blurred and faded behind me, I made a silent, solemn vow to the child growing inside me. You will be loved. You will be safe. And one day, I will have justice for what they did to us. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but that promise became the single, flickering flame I carried with me into the vast, terrifying darkness of the unknown. The train journey north was 18 hours of rattling steel and suffocating strangeness. I sat pressed against the window on a hard wooden bench in the third-class car, surrounded by families with hopeful eyes and worn-out suitcases, all of us running towards something or away from it. Every mile the train covered felt like a stitch pulling my life further and further apart from everything I had ever known. I watched the flat green fields of the South give way to the rolling hills of the heartland, and finally to the dense gray sprawl of industry that announced our arrival. Chicago's Union Station was not a place, it was a force of nature. I stepped off the train and was immediately swallowed by a roaring, rushing river of humanity. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. The ceiling soared stories above me like a cathedral, but the sounds were all man-made. the echoing announcements of a disembodied voice, the hiss of steam from the engines, the rumble of 1,000 conversations at once, and the hurried footsteps of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. I, on the other hand, was a stone in the middle of that river, paralyzed by the noise and the motion. The air smelled of coal smoke and roasted nuts and a kind of metallic urban dampness I had never experienced. Back home, the world was wide open, defined by the sky and the horizon. Here, the world was a canyon of brick and steel, and the sky was just a sliver of gray visible between the tops of buildings so tall they seemed to scrape the clouds. I clutched my cardboard suitcase and the piece of paper with my aunt's address, feeling smaller and more lost than I ever had in my life. My Aunt Clara was waiting for me just inside the main hall. I hadn't seen her in over a decade, and I barely recognized the stern, weary woman who peered at me over the crowd. The softness I remembered from my childhood had been worn away by years of city living and hard labor, leaving behind something more rigid and practical. "Mildred," she said, her voice lacking any real warmth. It wasn't unkind, just efficient. She gave me a quick, stiff hug that felt more like a brief inspection. "You've grown. Let's go. The streetcar won't wait." She didn't say another word during the noisy, lurching ride to her apartment. She knew why I was there. My mother's letter, filled with desperate euphemisms, would have made it plain enough. But she navigated the silence with a practiced ease. Like my mother, she understood that some truths were too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Her apartment was in a 5-story brick building in a neighborhood filled with other identical buildings. We climbed 4 flights of narrow, creaking stairs to a small 2-room flat that smelled of boiled cabbage and floor wax. It was impeccably clean but threadbare, every object in it purely functional, with no room for sentiment. "This will be your room," she said, pointing to a space that was little more than a closet with a cot pushed against one wall. "The bathroom is down the hall. We share it with the Polinskis. I work at the meatpacking plant from 6 in the morning until 6 at night. You'll be expected to keep the house clean and have dinner started when I get home. And the story," she added, turning to face me, her eyes clear and direct, "is that you are a widow. Your husband, Charles, died. You stick to that. People around here have their own problems. They won't ask too many questions if you don't give them a reason." That was it. The terms of my sanctuary were laid out. It was not a place of comfort, but a place to hide. Aunt Clara wasn't cruel. She was a survivor, and she was offering me a chance to become one too. In the weeks that followed, I fell into a lonely, monotonous routine. I cleaned the tiny apartment. I learned to navigate the local market. I sat by the window and watched a world I was not a part of. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant weight on my chest. Back home, I had been part of a community, for better or worse. Here, I was utterly anonymous, my southern accent marking me as an outsider every time I opened my mouth. The $50 my mother had given me was dwindling fast. I knew I couldn't depend on my aunt forever. I had to find work. Every morning, I would set out, my growing belly concealed beneath my loosest dress, and trudge through the gray, slushy streets. The rejections were swift and brutal. I'd walk into a factory, and the foreman would take one look at me and say, "We're not hiring." I'd ask for work at a diner, and the owner would shake his head. "Can't have a girl in your condition on her feet all day. It's a liability." The shame of it was almost as bad as the fear. Each closed door felt like a judgment, not just on my pregnancy, but on me. I was beginning to feel a creeping, cold despair when I saw a small, handwritten sign in the steamy window of a laundromat. "Help wanted." I pushed open the door, and a wave of warm, damp air smelling of soap and bleach washed over me. The place was run by a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Petrov, a stout woman with kind eyes and an accent much thicker than my own. She had come from Czechoslovakia after the war and had built this small business from nothing. Perhaps because she knew what it was like to be a stranger in a strange land, she looked at me with a compassion I hadn't seen in months. I gave her my well-rehearsed story about my dear departed husband Charles and my need to provide for my unborn child. She listened patiently, her head tilted to one side. "Life is hard, yes?" she said when I had finished, her English soft and accented. "And you are alone. I know this. You can work?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm a very hard worker." "Good," she said with a decisive nod. "You can start tomorrow, folding. The pay is not much, but it is honest. And when the baby comes, we will see. A baby needs its mother." That job was my lifeline. The work was grueling. Long hours on my feet, my hands raw from the hot, damp linens, the constant steam making it hard to breathe. But it was honest, as Mrs. Petroff had said. And for the first time since leaving home, I felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. The Chicago winter set in with a brutal, biting cold I was completely unprepared for. The wind that whipped off Lake Michigan cut through my thin coat and seemed to settle deep in my bones. As my pregnancy advanced, my body ached and my spirit flagged. But every night, in the quiet of my tiny room, I would place a hand on my swelling belly and feel the faint, fluttering movements inside. It was in those moments that I found my strength. This child, conceived in such violence and despair, was an innocent. This child was blameless. And I would be damned if I let the darkness of its origin define its life. I would build a world of love and safety for this baby, even if I had to do it with my own 2 broken hands. I began to invent a father for my child, not just for the outside world, but for the baby itself. I would whisper stories to my belly about Charles, the man from the cover story. I gave him a history, a personality. He was a kind, gentle boy from back home, quick with a laugh, strong and dependable. He had loved me fiercely, and he would have adored this child. In the lonely darkness of that Chicago winter, Charles became real to me, a phantom limb of a life I had never lived. It was a lie, but it felt like a prayer. On a cold, snowy day in early May of 1962, after a labor so long and arduous, I thought it would break me. My daughter was born. The moment the nurse placed her in my arms, the world shifted on its axis. She was so small, so perfect, with a furious cry that seemed too big for her tiny body. I looked at her, and the shame, the fear, the pain of the last 9 months simply vanished, replaced by a wave of love so fierce and protective it took my breath away. It was a pure, primal thing. I was her mother. I was her shield. I would be her world. "What will you name her?" the nurse asked, smiling. I had thought about it for months. I wanted a name that sounded strong, a name that spoke of a future, not a past. A name that had no connection to the humid, haunted landscape of Mississippi. "Donna," I said, the name feeling right on my tongue. "Her name is Donna." The first few years were a blur of exhaustion, love, and relentless work. I worked 6 days a week at the laundromat. Mrs. Petroff, true to her word, let me keep Donna in a wicker basket in the corner, where she slept sound to the rhythmic sloshing of the washing machines. It was a lonely, hard road. I see young single mothers today, and my heart goes out to them. It's never easy, but back then, the shame the world tried to put on you was a weight that could crush you if you let it. I wonder if any of you listening felt that same chill from the world. As Donna grew into a curious toddler, the questions began. "Mama, where is my daddy?" she asked one evening, her eyes wide and innocent. My heart fractured. I sat her on my lap and, for the first time, I told her the story of the brave and wonderful Charles, who had gone to heaven but who watched over her always. The lie was a bitter pill, but as I looked at her trusting face, I knew I would swallow it 1,000 times to protect her. For 6 years, it was just the two of us against the world. My life was small, circumscribed by our tiny apartment and the steamy laundromat. Then, in the spring of 1966, a man named Dennis walked into my life. He was a regular at the small diner where I had picked up a second job, waitressing in the evenings to make ends meet. He was a quiet man who worked at a steel mill, and he would come in for coffee and a piece of pie after his shift. He was different from the other men I had known. There was a gentleness to him, a steadiness in his eyes. He never tried to flirt or make clever remarks. He just watched me with a quiet respect that I found both unnerving and deeply comforting. After what Gary had done, I was terrified of men. I had built a fortress around my heart, and I had no intention of letting anyone in. I was polite to Dennis, but distant. I rebuffed his early, gentle attempts to start a conversation. But he was patient. He never pushed. He just kept coming to the diner, sitting at the same stool, treating me with the same unwavering kindness. The person who finally breached my defenses was Donna. One evening, I had to bring her to the diner with me for an hour before my aunt could pick her up. She was sitting in a booth coloring when Dennis came in. He saw her, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He walked over to her booth. "Well now, who is this lovely artist?" he asked. I watched from behind the counter, my whole body tense, ready to intervene. But Donna, who was usually shy around strangers, looked up at him and smiled back. He talked to her about her drawing, his voice soft and kind, treating her 4-year-old masterpiece with the utmost seriousness. He bought her a glass of milk and made her laugh, a sound that was like music to my ears. From that day on, whenever Dennis came in, his first smile was for Donna. Slowly, cautiously, I began to let him in. He would ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. He noticed when I was tired and told me I worked too hard. He started walking me home after my shift just to make sure we got back safely. One Sunday, he invited us to the park. I was hesitant, but Donna was so excited that I couldn't say no. We spent the afternoon pushing her on the swings and feeding the pigeons. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I laughed. A real, unburdened laugh. It felt like a rusty gate creaking open. Dennis courted me for nearly 2 years. It was a courtship of quiet walks, shared meals, and patient understanding. He never asked about my past, about Charles. He seemed to understand that I carried a deep wound, and he never poked at it. He simply created a space of safety and respect around me, waiting for me to feel ready to step into it. One evening in the early summer of 1968, we were sitting on a park bench while Donna chased fireflies in the twilight. "Mildred," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know you've been through a lot. I don't need to know the details. I just know that I love you, and I love that little girl over there like she was my own flesh and blood." He turned to me, his eyes full of a sincerity that I knew, finally, I could trust. "Let me take care of you both. Marry me. Let us be a family." I looked at this good, kind man and then at my daughter, her face lit with joy as she ran through the grass. He was offering us a life, a real one, not one of hiding and just getting by. He was offering Donna a father and me a partner. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. Could I trust this happiness? Did I deserve it? But then I looked at Donna again, and I knew I had to take the chance for her sake. "Yes," I whispered, the word feeling foreign and monumental. "Yes, Dennis, I'll marry you." We were married a month later at the city courthouse. Dennis legally adopted Donna, giving her his name and his whole heart. And in the years that followed, we had 2 sons of our own. For the first time since I was a girl, I had a real family. I had a home filled with laughter and the normal, everyday chaos of children. I had a husband who loved me, who was good and gentle and kind. I had built a life of impossible happiness out of the ashes of my past. The secret of Donna's true origin was buried deep, locked away in a part of my heart I never visited. I had my new life, my new family, and I foolishly believed that the past was finally, truly dead and gone. The years that followed my marriage to Dennis were a gift I never thought I'd receive. They unfolded with a gentle, reassuring rhythm, each one a brick in the new life I was so carefully building. Our 2 sons were born, filling our small home with the delightful noise and chaos that only little boys can bring. Dennis was a wonderful father, not just to his sons, but to Donna. He taught her how to ride a bike, holding the seat with a steady, patient hand. He helped her with her homework at the kitchen table, his brow furrowed in concentration over math problems he hadn't seen in 20 years. He was at every school play, every parent-teacher conference. He loved her without reservation, and in his unconditional love, she blossomed into a confident, brilliant young woman. For almost 50 years, I lived the life of an ordinary wife and mother. I packed lunches, kissed scraped knees, hosted birthday parties, and worried about report cards. I watched my children grow, go to college, fall in love, and start families of their own. Dennis and I grew old together, our love deepening into a quiet, comfortable partnership that was the anchor of my world. He was my safe harbor. With him, I was no longer the terrified girl on the train. I was Mildred, a wife, a mother, a grandmother. The secret of my past, of Donna's true origin, was buried so deep it almost felt like it had happened to someone else, a story I'd read in a book long ago. Almost. But in the dead of night, when the house was quiet, the ghost of that library would sometimes return, a cold whisper to remind me that my beautiful house was built on a foundation of lies. Our peaceful world tilted and then shattered in the winter of 2019. Dennis was diagnosed with lung cancer. For 18 months, I cared for him as the disease slowly, mercilessly stole the strong, steady man I loved. He faced his end with the same quiet dignity with which he had lived his life. In his final days, his hand frail in mine, he looked at me, his eyes clear and full of a lifetime of love. "You've been a good wife, Mildred," he whispered, his voice a thread of sound. "The best. You gave me a wonderful life. You're the strongest woman I've ever known." In that moment, I was sure he knew. Not the details, not the names, but he knew that I had come to him from a place of great pain, and he had loved me all the more for it. He never asked, and I never told, and that silent understanding was his final gift to me. His passing left a hole in my life so vast and deep, I thought I might fall into it. My children rallied around me, especially Donna. Now 58 years old, she had become everything I had ever dreamed for her and more. She was a renowned investigative journalist for one of Chicago's biggest newspapers, a woman known for her tenacity, her sharp mind, and her unshakable commitment to uncovering the truth. She had a wonderful husband, 2 grown children of her own, my beautiful grandchildren, and a career built on giving a voice to the voiceless. The irony was a constant, dull ache in my heart. It was about a year after Dennis had passed, on a gray autumn afternoon in 2020, that the past came knocking. Donna had come over for our weekly dinner, her face flushed with the excitement of a new project. "Mom, you will not believe the story I'm working on," she said, setting a stack of folders on my kitchen table. "It's a passion project, something I've wanted to do for years, a historical deep dive." "That sounds wonderful, dear," I said, serving her a plate of pot roast. "What's it about?" "It's about the shadow hierarchies of the old rural South," she explained, her eyes alight with intellectual fire. "Specifically, the systemic abuse of power by wealthy, land-owning families in the 50s and 60s. I'm talking about generations of sharecroppers trapped in debt, local sheriffs in the pockets of these patriarchs, and, well, the women." She paused, her expression hardening. The stories of what happened to young women, especially the ones who worked in the main houses, are just horrific. Crimes that were never reported, lives that were destroyed, all swept under the rug to protect the family name. I felt a sudden chill, a cold dread that started in my stomach and spread through my veins. I set the serving spoon down with a clatter, my hand suddenly unsteady. What kind of stories?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "All kinds," she said, oblivious to my turmoil. "But the pattern is sickeningly consistent. A powerful son, feeling entitled to everything and everyone on his father's land, preys on a vulnerable young woman, a maid, a sharecropper's daughter. When she gets pregnant, which happened more often than not, she's the one who is shamed and punished. The families either force a quick marriage to someone else, or more commonly, they just send the girl away. North, usually. They vanish them, and the problem goes away." I had to grip the edge of the counter to stay upright. My own life story, my deepest, most guarded secret, was being laid out on my kitchen table like a case study, a historical anecdote. "I'm focusing my initial research on one particularly powerful family in Mississippi," she continued, flipping open a folder. "They owned thousands of acres, basically an entire county, the Harringtons." The name hit me like a physical blow. The room tilted, the air growing thin. I swayed on my feet, and the plate of food I was holding slipped from my nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor in an explosion of ceramic and gravy. "Mom!" Donna cried, jumping up from her chair. "Are you all right? You're as white as a ghost." "Fine, I'm fine," I gasped, bending down to pick up the shards with a trembling hand, desperate to hide my face. Just a dizzy spell. Old age, you know." Donna knelt beside me, her brow furrowed with concern. "Maybe you shouldn't be on your feet so much. Here, let me get that. You just sit down." She helped me to a chair, her touch gentle, her worry so genuine it felt like a knife in my heart. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have bored you with all that grim history. It's upsetting stuff." No, I insisted, forcing a weak smile. "It's important work, Donna. Very important. You find the truth." That night, sleep was impossible. The ghost of the past was no longer a whisper. It was a roaring monster, awakened from its 60-year slumber, and my own daughter was the one prodding it. The following weeks were a torment unlike any I had ever known. Donna, energized by her investigation, would call me with updates. Each phone call was a new turn of the screw. "Mom, you won't believe this," she said one evening, her voice crackling with a reporter's excitement. "I found one of them, one of the women. She's 81, living in a nursing home in Detroit. She worked for the Harringtons in the summer of 1959. She told me everything, how the son, Gary, cornered her in the pantry, how he threatened her family if she ever told. They sent her to live with a cousin in Michigan when she started to show." I sat in my armchair, the phone pressed to my ear, my knuckles white. I was listening to a stranger's story, and it was my own. A week later, another call. "I found another one, Mom, in Sacramento." Her story is almost identical, but it happened in 1963. She said Gary was like a predator, that he seemed to enjoy their fear. She had a son, raised him by herself, telling him his father died a hero in Vietnam. I began to feel like I was losing my mind, trapped in a surreal echo chamber where my daughter's voice was narrating the worst moments of my life, completely unaware of my connection to them. The weight of the secret, a burden I had carried for so long I had forgotten its true heft, was now crushing me. What was I supposed to do? How could I tell my daughter, a woman in the twilight of her own life, that her entire identity was a lie? That her father was not the gentle, departed Charles, but the very monster she was hunting? The truth would destroy her image of herself, of me, of the good man who had raised her. It would taint every happy memory we had ever made. But how could I not tell her? What if she found out some other way? What if she uncovered my name in some old record? Or if another victim remembered a girl named Mildred, who had worked there in the summer of '61 and then suddenly disappeared? The thought of her learning the truth from a dusty piece of paper or from the mouth of a stranger was unbearable. It had to come from me. It was my story, my pain, my lie. It had to be my truth to tell. The following weekend, I did something I hadn't done in 60 years. I told Donna I was going to visit an old friend for a few days, a small lie to cover a much larger one. I bought a bus ticket and traveled south, back to Mississippi. The journey was the reverse of my flight into exile. The closer I got, the thicker the air felt, the more the landscape began to pull at old, forgotten wounds. The town had changed, but not much. It was smaller, sadder, many of the storefronts on the main street boarded up. I stayed at a small motel, a stranger in my own homeland. I visited the graveyard and stood before the simple, weathered headstones of my parents, Earl and Lois. They had died within years of each other in the late 1980s. We had exchanged sparse, careful letters over the decades, but I had never gone back, not even for their funerals. The chasm between us, created that day in our dusty yard, had been too wide to cross. I wept for them, and for the girl they had sent away, and for the love that had been suffocated by fear. Then, I rented a car and drove out to the old Harrington place. The grand white gates were rusted, one hanging crookedly on its hinges. The long drive was overgrown with weeds. The big house still stood on its hill, but it was a decaying ghost of its former self. Paint was peeling from the columns in long strips, and some of the windows were boarded up. It looked like a house that was rotting from the inside out, consumed by its own dark history. From an old woman at the town's only diner, I learned that Gary Harrington still lived there. His parents were long dead. His wife had left him decades ago, and he'd never had any legitimate children. He was an old man now, a bitter, reclusive invalid, cared for by a hired nurse. He was still alive. Seeing that house, knowing he was in it, solidified something in me. This wasn't just history. This was a living thing. And I could not, would not, let my daughter be the one to stumble into its jaws alone. I drove back to the motel, my course set. I returned to Chicago with a heavy, resolute heart. The time for protection was over. The time for truth had come. I called Donna that evening. "Can you come over, dear?" I asked, my voice betraying none of the storm raging inside me. "There's something I need to talk to you about. Something important." "Of course, Mom," she said, her own voice warm and unsuspecting. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I lied one last time. "I'll see you soon." She arrived an hour later, bringing with her a gust of cold night air and a cheerful smile that made my heart ache. I made us tea, my hands moving with a slow, deliberate calmness that felt completely detached from my racing pulse. We sat in our usual spots in the living room, surrounded by pictures of our family, of Dennis, of the beautiful life we had built. "So, what's up?" she asked, taking a sip of her tea. "You sounded so serious on the phone." I took a deep breath, the air shuddering as it entered my lungs. I looked at my daughter, this strong, brilliant woman I was so proud of, and I prepared to detonate the bomb I had been carrying for her entire life. "It's about your investigation," I began, my voice quiet but steady. "The Harrington family." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "What about it?" I met her eyes, holding her gaze, praying she would see the love behind the words I was about to say. "Donna," I said, my voice finally breaking. "The story you are writing, it is my story. I am one of those women. And that man you are investigating, that monster, Gary Harrington, he is your biological father." The silence that followed my words was not empty. It was a dense, heavy thing, filled with the deafening roar of a life being torn down to its foundations. Donna stared at me, her face a mask of utter disbelief. The teacup in her hand trembled, rattling softly against its saucer. For a long moment, she didn't speak, didn't move. She just searched my face, her journalist's eyes, trained to find the truth, now desperately seeking any sign that this was a horrible, cruel joke. "What?" she finally whispered, the word a puff of air, fragile and broken. "What did you just say?" "The man you're writing about," I repeated, my voice steady despite the fact that my own world was crumbling alongside hers. "Gary Harrington. He is your biological father. There was no Charles. There was no accident. There was only him, and that night, and then there was you." She shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement of denial. No, that's not true. My father was Charles. He died." "You told me. All my life, you told me." Her voice trailed off as the implications of what I was saying began to cascade over her. The story of Charles, the gentle hero, the entire narrative of her childhood was dissolving before her eyes like a photograph dipped in acid. She stood up abruptly, the teacup crashing to the floor, and began to pace the small living room like a caged animal. "A lie?" she said, her voice rising with a mixture of hysteria and rage. "My entire life has been a lie. You lied to me? Every time I asked about him, every time I looked at that picture you kept, every story you told me. It was all a lie?" "It was a shield, Donna," I pleaded, my own tears finally beginning to fall. "It was a story to protect you from a truth I thought would destroy you." "Protect me?" She spun to face me, her face contorted with a pain so deep it was terrifying to behold. "Protect me? You let me grow up worshipping a ghost while my father was a monster. You let me walk through life with a giant gaping hole where my history was supposed to be, and you filled it with fiction. How could you do that to me?" The accusation, the raw anguish in it, pierced me to the core. "Because I was 18 years old, terrified and utterly alone," I cried out, the 60 years of silence finally erupting from me. I was a child, and another child was growing inside me, a child conceived in a horror you cannot imagine. My own parents threw me away to hide their shame. I came to this city with nothing but $50 and a story. That story was the only thing I had to give you that wasn't covered in filth and pain. It was the only gift I could give you, a clean start, a father you could be proud of. It was a lie born from a love so fierce I would have done anything, to keep you safe from the truth of what he was, of what he did to me. We stayed up all night, talking until the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows. The storm of her rage eventually subsided, replaced by waves of gut-wrenching sobs. I told her everything. Every humiliating detail of that night, the terror of the following weeks, my parents' cold rejection, the lonely journey north, the struggle to survive. I laid my soul bare for my daughter, and as she listened, I saw her anger slowly, painfully, begin to transform into a dawning, horrified understanding. She was not just grieving the loss of her identity. She was grieving for the terrified young girl her mother had once been. "All those years," she whispered, as the sun came up, her voice raw from crying. "You carried this all by yourself. While you were raising us, laughing with Dad, you were carrying this." "I had to," I said simply. "You were my future. I couldn't let my past poison that." She came and sat beside me on the sofa, taking my worn, age-spotted hand in hers. The chasm between us was still there, but for the first time, a bridge was being built across it. "This changes everything," she said, her voice no longer angry, but filled with a grim, hard resolve I knew all too well. "My investigation. It's not just a story anymore." "I know," I said. "He doesn't get to win," she said, her eyes flashing with a new fire. "He doesn't get to die a respected old man in his decaying mansion while his victims are still living with the scars. We're going to tell the story, Mom. But this time, we're going to tell the real story. Our story." In that moment, our relationship was reforged. We were no longer just mother and daughter, bound by love and a gentle lie. We were partners, united by a terrible truth and a shared mission for justice. The next few months were intense. Donna put her original newspaper story on hold. This was bigger than that. This was a book. We worked on it together, day after day. The process was excruciating and liberating. I dredged up memories I had kept buried for a lifetime, and Donna, with her journalist's skill and her daughter's heart, helped me shape them into a narrative. We cried together. We raged together. We found a strength in our shared purpose that I had never imagined possible. As word of the project quietly spread through Donna's professional network, something incredible happened. More women came forward. The two she had already found convinced others to speak. We ended up with the sworn, on-the-record testimonies of 7 women whose lives had been irrevocably damaged by Gary Harrington. We were nearing the end of the manuscript in the fall of 2021 when the past made one last, desperate attempt to silence us. A man came to my door one afternoon. He was dressed in an expensive suit, with a polished, predatory smile that instantly transported me back 60 years. He introduced himself as a lawyer representing the Harrington estate. "Mrs. Mildred," he began, his voice oozing a false sincerity. "It has come to our attention that your daughter is writing a book of a historical nature, a book that could be seen as defamatory to a respected elderly man in poor health." I stood in my doorway, my hand on the door, and I felt not a flicker of the old fear. The terrified girl was gone. A woman who had survived, who had raised a family, who had found her voice, stood in her place. "Is there a point to this visit?" I asked, my voice cold. His smile tightened. "My client is a generous man. He understands that life can be difficult. He is prepared to offer you a sum of $100,000, a gesture of goodwill, in exchange for ensuring this work of fiction is never published." I looked at him, at his expensive shoes on my worn welcome mat, and I felt a laugh, a real, bitter laugh, bubble up from my chest. $100,000? I said. "You think you can buy my silence? You think my life, my daughter's life, the lives of all those other women can be bought for $100,000? You can tell Gary Harrington that I would not spit on him if he were on fire. Now get off my property before I call the police." His face hardened, the mask of civility dropping away. "I would think very carefully about that, old woman," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "Journalists have accidents, especially the kind who dig into things that should remain buried. It would be a tragedy for something to happen to your daughter." But what he didn't know was that Donna, anticipating something like this, had insisted I wear a small recording device. His threat, his bribe, his admission of who he represented, it was all captured. The moment he left, I called Donna. "We've got him," I said. That threat was the final nail in Gary Harrington's coffin. We turned the recording over to the police and to the press. The story exploded. It was no longer a historical crime. It was a current event. The narrative was irresistible. A powerful, wealthy family trying to intimidate and silence an 82-year-old great-grandmother to cover up 60 years of abuse. The media frenzy was instantaneous. News vans descended on my quiet Chicago street and on that sleepy Mississippi town. The national spotlight was a cleansing fire. Under its intense glare, the carefully constructed facade of the Harrington family legacy crumbled to dust in a matter of days. Gary Harrington, the man who had lived his life protected by a shield of power and fear, found himself exposed, his name becoming a national synonym for monstrous privilege. 3 days after the story of the threat broke, we received a call from the nurse who cared for him. She said he had been watching the evening news, which was leading with a picture of his decaying mansion and a headline that read, the monster on the hill. He had flown into a rage, screaming obscenities about me, about Donna, about all the women who had dared to speak. And then, in the midst of his hateful tirade, he had clutched his chest and collapsed. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. I felt no joy at the news of his death. I felt no satisfaction, no thirst for vengeance quenched. All I felt was a profound, quiet sense of release. A weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying had been lifted. He was gone. He could not hurt anyone, ever again. Our book, which we titled The Silence of the Fields, was published 2 months later. It became an unexpected bestseller. But more important than the sales was the impact. Our story opened a floodgate. Hundreds of elderly women from all over the country began to come forward, telling their own long-buried stories of abuse at the hands of powerful men. The book was credited with helping to change laws, extending the statute of limitations for sexual assault cases in several states. A foundation was started in my name, a center dedicated to providing legal and psychological support for elderly survivors of historical abuse. Now, as I sit here in my quiet apartment, I am 82 years old, and for the first time in my life, I feel completely at peace. The ghosts have been laid to rest. My daughter, Donna, has become one of the most respected voices in the country, dedicating her work to advocating for women. My grandchildren know the whole story, and they look at me not with pity, but with a respect and love that fills my heart. The greatest victory was not in watching my tormentor die. It was in seeing my daughter thrive. It was in taking the ugliest, most painful secret and transforming it into a beacon of hope for others. It was in breaking the silence and discovering that I was never, ever truly alone. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows, maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.